Sometimes the word traitor says more about the crowd than the person wearing it. The post stood in the center of the compound yard, 12 feet tall, weathered oak bleached by sun and wind. A length of rope looped around it like an afterthought. Beneath it stood a young German POW nurse, Lieselotte Hartmann, wrists bound in front of her, shoulders straight despite the strain. A wooden placard hanging from a rough cord at her neck, with one word painted in thick black letters. Traitor. The West Texas sky stretched wide and merciless above Camp Hearn. Late afternoon heat. Pressing down at 98 degrees. Dust moving low across the packed earth like a living thing. British liaison officer Captain Edward Callahan stepped out of the administration building, gloves tucked under one arm, brim of his cap cutting a sharp line against the glare, and he stopped mid-stride when he saw her. He had witnessed many things in uniform. Burned fields, surrendered regiments, the long quiet after artillery. But this was different. This was deliberate humiliation dressed up as discipline. A cluster of prisoners stood several yards away, silent, watchful. A few Allied guards lingered near the fence line, uncertain, as if waiting for someone else to define the moment. Callahan did not raise his voice. He did not rush forward. He simply studied the scene the way an officer studies a map before moving troops. The nurse did not look at the ground. She was scanning the yard, eyes moving from face to face with clinical focus, as if counting heartbeats, as if checking for fever. A medic even now. The rope had left faint red impressions against the cuffs of her gray uniform, but her posture remained precise, chin level, breathing measured. A guard cleared his throat and offered an explanation about internal discipline, about accusations from other prisoners, about rules that had to be maintained. Callahan listened without blinking. The word traitor shifted in the hot wind, knocking softly against her collarbone. He stepped closer, boots crunching on gravel, until he stood no more than 3 feet away. Up close he saw details others had missed. The faint scent of antiseptic soap still clinging to her sleeves, the careful way she held her fingers to keep circulation steady, the steadiness in her gaze. This was not defiance. It was restraint. Who authorized this? He asked quietly. No one answered at first. A prisoner finally spoke, explaining she had given medical supplies to another detainee accused of breaking camp rules. She had treated a fever without permission. She had chosen care over compliance. Callahan let the silence stretch. A breeze moved through the yard, lifting the edge of the sign so that it tapped once against the wood behind her. The crowd shifted. No one met his eyes. He looked back at the nurse. She did not plead. She did not explain. She simply stood, as if the word hanging from her neck belonged to someone else. Callahan removed his gloves slowly, folding them with deliberate care, and in that small, measured gesture the temperature of the yard seemed to change. Cruelty, he knew, often hid behind procedure. Dignity rarely needed permission. He turned slightly toward the nearest guard, voice calm but edged with command. "Cut her down," he said. And in that instant every man in the yard understood that something more than a rope was about to be removed. The rope fell away with a soft thud against the dust, and for a moment no one moved. Lieselotte Hartmann did not step back immediately, as if her body needed to remember what unrestrained balance felt like. She flexed her fingers once, slowly, restoring circulation, then lifted her hands to remove the wooden placard from her neck. The word brushed against her collarbone before she lowered it, holding it carefully rather than letting it drop. Captain Edward Callahan watched her the way he would watch a soldier regaining footing after a long march, not with pity, but with assessment. Around them, the yard remained suspended in a silence thick as the August heat. One of the German prisoners shifted his weight and muttered something about order, about loyalty, about how discipline held the camp together. Callahan turned toward the small group without raising his voice. He asked for names, for specifics, for a clear accusation beyond rumor. The answers came in fragments. She had given bandages to a man who had broken work rules. She had cooled his fever without permission. She had chosen care over compliance. Callahan listened, hands now clasped behind his back, posture precise. He asked a simple question that lingered in the air longer than the dust. Was the man alive? There was hesitation. Yes, someone admitted. He was alive. The nurse had kept him from worsening under the heat that had reached 100 degrees the previous afternoon. Callahan nodded once. As if confirming a detail on a report, he stepped closer to Lieselot, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. He asked whether she understood why she had been accused. Her answer came in careful English, accented but steady. She said that fever does not ask about loyalty. It asks for water. The sentence settled between them with the weight of something undeniable. Callahan turned back to the gathered prisoners and addressed them in measured tones. He reminded them that under the Geneva Convention medical personnel retained certain responsibilities, even in confinement. He spoke of order not as humiliation, but as restraint. The guards along the fence straightened subtly, sensing the shift. This was no longer a spectacle, it was an evaluation. Callahan instructed that Lieselot be transferred to the infirmary detail under supervised assignment. Not a reward, not an exemption, but a placement aligned with her training. He made it clear that accusations would be documented formally rather than displayed publicly. Procedure, he implied, could serve dignity as easily as it could undermine it. The prisoners dispersed gradually, some silent, some thoughtful, the word traitor now lying face down in the dust where Lieselot had placed it. She did not look back at the post. Instead, she adjusted the sleeves of her gray uniform, smoothing the fabric as though restoring order to something internal. As she began to walk toward the infirmary barracks, Callahan noticed the steadiness in her stride. Not hurried, not hesitant, simply forward. The sun remained high and relentless, but the yard felt altered, as if an invisible line had been redrawn. A young guard approached Callahan quietly and asked whether this decision might cause resentment. Callahan replied that resentment fades. Precedent remains. He glanced once more at the empty post standing against the vast Texas sky, and he understood that the most fragile structures in a camp were not the fences or the barracks, but the standards by which people chose to treat one another. The infirmary barracks smelled of soap, starch, and the faint metallic hint of antiseptic that clung to wooden floors no matter how often they were scrubbed. Ceiling fans turned slowly overhead, pushing thick afternoon air in wide, lazy circles. Lieselot Hartmann stood just inside the doorway for a brief second, adjusting to the dimmer light after the glare of the yard. A British medic, Sergeant Thomas Whitaker, looked up from a folding table where glass thermometers rested in a neat row. He studied her gray uniform, then glanced at the captain standing behind her. No questions were asked out loud. None were needed. Callahan simply nodded once, a quiet confirmation of authority, then stepped aside. This was her ground now. Lieselot moved toward the nearest cot, where a young prisoner lay sweating through a thin blanket, his skin flushed from heat that had climbed past 100 degrees earlier that week. She did not rush. She placed her palm against his forehead, then to his own wrist, counting seconds beneath her breath. Her posture changed in that instant. The yard had held accusation. This room held purpose. She requested cool water, clean cloth, and permission to check the camp supply ledger. Her English was careful, each word placed with intention. Whitaker hesitated for half a heartbeat, then handed her the basin. Procedure said she was still a detainee. Reality said she was the most qualified person in the room. Outside, the compound settled into its late afternoon rhythm. Boots crossed gravel. Distant voices drifted and faded. Inside the infirmary, time narrowed to pulse and breath. Callahan remained near the doorway, not interfering, only observing. He watched how the nurse elevated the prisoner's feet by exactly 6 inches using a folded blanket, how she measured water by ounces. Rather than guesswork, how she spoke to the patient in low, steady tones that carried neither sympathy nor judgment, only clarity. Fever, she explained, is a condition of the body, not a verdict on character. Whitaker found himself following her instructions without resistance. Together they moved through the small ward, checking temperatures, marking readings in neat script. The earlier accusation seemed distant here, almost unreal, as if it belonged to another camp entirely. At one point, Lieselot paused beside a narrow window where sunlight cut a bright rectangle across the floor. She looked out briefly toward the yard, toward the place where the wooden post still stood. Her expression did not harden, it did not soften. It simply remained composed. Callahan stepped closer and asked, quietly, whether she regretted her decision. She answered without turning. If a man is ill, she said, he is ill. the rest is noise. The sentence lingered in the warm air, settling into the wooden beams above them. Callahan felt something shift inside him. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady. Leadership, he understood, was not proven in speeches or punishments. It was revealed in moments when no one expected fairness. As evening approached and the temperature dropped to 86 degrees, the infirmary lights flickered on. The prisoners' fever began to ease, numbers lowering by degrees. Whitaker exhaled in quiet relief. Lisa Lott washed her hands with deliberate care, drying them on a clean towel before folding it precisely along the edge of the basin. Outside, the last light of day painted the camp in long shadows. Inside, order had been restored not by force, but by competence. Callahan removed his cap as he prepared to leave, offering a brief nod that carried more respect than apology. In the stillness of the ward, beneath the slow-turning fans, one truth had become clear. Dignity, once defended, tends to defend itself. Evening settled over Camp Hearn with a slower breath, the heat finally loosening its grip as the temperature dipped below 80 degrees, and lantern light began to glow along the wooden barracks. In the infirmary, Liselott Hartmann finished recording the last temperature of the day in careful, upright script, her handwriting steady despite the long hours. The prisoner she had treated was sleeping now, his breathing even. A damp cloth folded neatly at his temple. Sergeant Thomas Whitaker leaned against the supply cabinet, arms crossed, watching her with a look that had shifted from skepticism to reluctant respect. Outside, boots moved along the gravel path, and word of the afternoon had traveled farther than the dust. Some prisoners viewed her with quiet gratitude, others with narrowed eyes. Inside the administrative office, Captain Edward Callahan sat at a wooden desk beneath a single hanging bulb, drafting a formal report in black ink. He did not embellish. He described the accusation, the public display, the medical necessity, and his decision. He chose his words the way he chose his commands, precise and without apology. A knock came at the door. Lieutenant Harold Bennett stepped inside, closing it behind him. He asked, carefully, whether it had been wise to override internal discipline. Callahan did not look up immediately. He finished his sentence, sanded the page, then met the lieutenant's gaze. He replied that discipline without judgment becomes spectacle. Bennett shifted his weight, mentioning the risk of setting expectations among detainees. Callahan answered that expectations of fairness were not a threat. They were a standard. The room fell quiet except for the faint buzz of the bulb overhead. Beyond the window, the camp stretched under a pale sky streaked with fading light. Back in the infirmary, Liselott rinsed metal instruments in warm water measured exactly to the line marked on the enamel basin. She worked with the same measured rhythm she had shown all afternoon, not hurried, not hesitant. Whitaker cleared his throat and asked why she had not defended herself more forcefully in the yard. She paused only briefly before answering that truth does not grow stronger when shouted. The sentence lingered between them. Whitaker nodded once, absorbing it. As night deepened, a breeze moved through the open windows, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant cattle. The camp had not changed in structure, but something subtle had shifted in tone. Prisoners who passed the infirmary door glanced in not with suspicion, but with a new calculation. Authority, they realized, could be measured in restraint. Callahan stepped outside his office and walked the length of the compound, hands clasped behind his back, boots steady against the wooden planks of the walkway. He paused when he reached the empty post in the yard. The rope had been coiled and removed, the sign taken away. Only the faint indentation in the dust remained. He studied it for a long moment under the rising moon. Leadership, he understood, was not the loudest voice in the yard. It was the quiet refusal to let humiliation pass as policy. Inside the infirmary, Liselott extinguished the final lamp and stood for a moment in the dim glow of the hallway light. She did not dwell on the accusation. She did not replay the crowd. She reviewed instead the pulse rates, the hydration levels, the tasks for tomorrow. In a place defined by confinement, she had chosen function over fear as the camp settled into night and the wind pressed softly against the wooden walls. One fact had become undeniable. The line between order and cruelty is thin, but it is drawn by those who decide where to stand. Morning arrived without ceremony. pale light stretching across the compound before the sun cleared the horizon. By 6:30 the temperature was already climbing past 75 degrees, the promise of another long Texas day settling over the wooden barracks. Liselott Hartmann stepped into the infirmary with her sleeves rolled precisely 2 inches above her wrists, a small notebook tucked beneath her arm. She had slept lightly, reviewing in her mind the pulse readings from the night before, calculating fluid intake against heat index. Inside the ward, ceiling fans turned with a low mechanical hum, stirring air that still carried the scent of soap and canvas. Sergeant Thomas Whitaker handed her the morning report without comment. 3 minor dehydration cases, 1 persistent cough, no fevers above 100 degrees. She nodded once and moved cot to cot, measuring, adjusting, documenting. Her movements were efficient, almost spare, as if she believed excess motion wasted strength. Outside, whispers moved faster than the breeze. Some prisoners now watched her with a new distance, uncertain whether to see her as ally or threat. Others offered brief, respectful nods when passing the infirmary door. Reputation in a camp traveled by inches, not miles. Captain Edward Callahan stood near the perimeter fence, reviewing inspection notes with Lieutenant Harold Bennett. Bennett mentioned again the tension among the detainees, the concern that internal grievances might surface more openly. Callahan listened, eyes scanning the yard where men lined up for work detail under a sky turning bright blue. He responded that sunlight exposes weakness and strength equally, the measure of a camp was how it handled both. Later that morning, a prisoner approached the infirmary hesitantly, hat in hand, requesting assistance for a blistered palm sustained during field labor. Liselott examined the injury without comment on the man's earlier silence in the yard. She cleaned the area with careful pressure, applied a sterile dressing, and instructed him on keeping the bandage dry. Her tone remained neutral, neither warm nor cold. The prisoner cleared his throat before leaving and murmured a quiet thank you in German. She inclined her head once in acknowledgement, nothing more. By midday the heat reached 99 degrees, and work crews returned briefly for water. Callahan walked past the infirmary window and observed through the glass as Liselott guided 2 men through breathing exercises to prevent dizziness. There was no display, no attempt to claim authority, only competence. Whitaker later remarked that the ward had grown calmer since her placement, fewer raised voices, fewer complaints. Callahan absorbed the comment without visible reaction, yet he felt the subtle shift ripple through the compound. Standards, once demonstrated, rarely remain isolated. As afternoon light slanted across the yard, the wooden post still stood unused, casting a thin shadow across the dust. It had become less a symbol of punishment and more a reminder of choice. Inside the infirmary, Liselott closed her notebook and looked briefly toward the open window where the wind lifted the edge of a curtain. She did not appear triumphant. She appeared steady, in a place defined by rigid lines and fixed routines. She had introduced something quieter but stronger, the expectation that skill and integrity would speak before accusation. And as the sun dipped westward and the camp settled into another evening under a vast and cloudless sky, Captain Edward Callahan understood that authority had not weakened in the past 24 hours. It had clarified. The third day after the incident began with a dry wind moving in from the west, carrying fine red dust that settled along the fence lines and beneath the wooden steps of the barracks. By 8 o'clock the temperature had already reached 82 degrees, and the sky was an uninterrupted blue that offered no mercy. Inside the infirmary, Liselott Hartmann reorganized the supply shelves with deliberate precision, aligning gauze rolls by size, marking glass bottles with fresh ink where labels had faded. Routine, she believed, was a form of quiet defense. Sergeant Thomas Whitaker entered carrying a clipboard and a folded memo. He hesitated before handing it to her. The paper bore an official stamp from Regional Command requesting clarification regarding her new assignment. The tone was neutral, but the implication was clear. Someone beyond the camp walls had taken notice. Liselott read the lines once, then placed the memo neatly beside her notebook. She did not ask what would happen next. She returned to preparing a hydration mixture measured to exact ounces. Outside, Captain Edward Callahan stood beneath the narrow shade of the administration porch, reading a similar inquiry delivered through military courier. Lieutenant Harold Bennett waited nearby, aware that reports could ripple outward in ways difficult to predict. Callahan folded the document slowly, sliding it into his breast pocket. He had expected scrutiny. What interested him was not the question itself, but the principle beneath it. As the morning progressed, a work crew returned early with one man complaining of dizziness under the rising heat. Now climbing past 94 degrees, Lieselot guided him to a cot, elevating his feet and checking his pulse with calm concentration. Two other prisoners lingered near the doorway, watching her hands move with practiced steadiness. No one mentioned the yard. No one mentioned the sign. What mattered was the steady lowering of a pulse rate from 110 to 96 within minutes. Whitaker glanced toward the open window where Callahan stood speaking quietly with Bennett, the captain's expression revealed nothing dramatic, only thoughtfulness. He understood that authority was being examined not by rumor now, but by paperwork. By noon, the heat pressed down at 99 degrees, and the infirmary fans strained against the thick air. Lieselot continued her rounds, pausing only once to sip water from a tin cup before returning to her notes. Outside, Bennett approached Callahan again, asking whether it might have been easier to allow internal discipline to proceed. Callahan answered without hesitation that ease and correctness rarely share the same path. He explained that the camp would respond to clarity more reliably than to fear. As afternoon shadows lengthened, a courier jeep arrived at the outer gate, engine humming against the stillness. A sealed envelope changed hands. Inside the infirmary, Lieselot finished adjusting a bandage and looked briefly toward the yard where the wooden post stood unused. Casting a thin line across the dust, she did not appear anxious. She appeared prepared. When Whitaker informed her that command might request a formal statement, she nodded once and said that she would describe only what occurred. Nothing more, nothing less. As the sun dipped toward the horizon and the temperature eased below 85 degrees, Callahan unfolded the new directive beneath the fading light. The message did not condemn his decision. It requested review. He allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible exhale. Leadership, he reflected, is not tested by silence. It is tested by scrutiny. Across the compound, lanterns flickered on one by one, and in the infirmary the nurse continued her work without pause, steady as the slow turning of the ceiling fans, aware that standards defended in daylight must endure under review. The review board arrived on a Thursday morning just after 9 o'clock, their staff car rolling through the outer gate beneath a sky already pushing past 85 degrees. Dust followed the tires in a slow red cloud that drifted across the compound before settling along the fence posts. Two officers stepped out, uniforms crisp despite the heat, boots polished, expressions neutral in the practiced way of men accustomed to evaluating others. Captain Edward Callahan met them halfway across the yard, posture straight, cap brim cutting a clean shadow across his eyes. Introductions were brief, voices measured. No accusations were spoken aloud, only the language of procedure and inquiry. Inside the infirmary, Lieselot Hartmann was adjusting a chart at the end of a cot when Sergeant Thomas Whitaker informed her that command wished to speak with her. She did not flinch. She washed her hands thoroughly, dried them with deliberate care, and followed him into the bright morning light. The yard felt different under inspection, quieter, as if even the wind had chosen restraint. The wooden post still stood off to one side, and used, its surface pale against the sun. One of the visiting officers asked Lieselot to explain her actions in her own words. She spoke in steady English, neither defensive nor apologetic. She described a fever that had risen above 102 degrees, dehydration measured in ounces, the risk of heat stroke under 99 degrees sun. She stated that she had used available supplies to prevent worsening condition. She did not mention the sign. She did not mention humiliation. She spoke only of pulse rates and hydration. The officers listened, occasionally making notes. One asked whether she understood camp regulations. She answered that she did, and that medical responsibility does not vanish behind wire. The sentence hung in the warm air, precise and unembellished. Callahan stood several feet away, hands clasped behind his back, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption. The officers then requested to see the patient in question. Inside the infirmary, they observed a man now sitting upright, temperature steady at 98.6 degrees. Color returned to his face. Whitaker provided documentation of readings taken every hour. Numbers, not opinions. Outside again, the officers conferred in low tones. Bennett watched from near the administration porch, aware that the outcome would ripple outward. After several minutes, the senior officer approached Callahan. He did not offer praise. He did not offer reprimand. He stated simply that the assignment would stand pending continued compliance with protocol. Oversight would increase. Standards would be reviewed. Callahan inclined his head once in acknowledgement. As the staff car departed in a haze of dust, the compound exhaled. Whispers resumed. Boots crossed gravel. Routine reclaimed the morning. Lisa Lott returned to the infirmary without ceremony. Picking up her notebook where she had left it, she recorded the next hydration check in clear, upright script. Callahan paused briefly beside the empty post before walking back toward his office. He did not feel triumphant. He felt steadied. Authority had been tested in open daylight and had not fractured. Under a Texas sun now climbing past 93 degrees, the camp continued its rhythm. But something quiet had been confirmed. Dignity defended under scrutiny becomes precedent, and precedent, once set, does not easily retreat. The days after the inspection unfolded with a subtle but undeniable shift, as if the compound itself had recalibrated under the weight of observation. By the following Monday, the temperature reached 97 degrees before noon, heat pressing down on tin roofs and wooden barracks until the air shimmered above the packed earth. Inside the infirmary, Lisa Lott Hartman moved through her duties with the same deliberate rhythm she had shown since her reassignment, measuring hydration in ounces, counting pulse beats against the steady tick of a pocket watch Sergeant Thomas Whitaker had begun leaving on the table for her use. Trust, in this place, did not arrive with declarations. It arrived in small permissions. Outside, work details lined up beneath the unbroken Texas sky, and conversations carried a different tone. Fewer whispers, fewer sideways glances. The man whose fever she had treated now walked with steady steps, returning each afternoon to the infirmary not for necessity but to assist in carrying water buckets from the pump. He did not speak much. He simply worked. Captain Edward Callahan observed these adjustments without commentary. He walked the perimeter at measured intervals, boots striking gravel in even cadence, aware that authority is reinforced not by repetition but by consistency. Lieutenant Harold Bennett approached him near the fence line one late afternoon as the temperature dipped below 88 degrees. Bennett noted that disciplinary reports had decreased over the past week. Callahan responded that when fairness becomes predictable, unrest loses oxygen. The wooden post in the yard had begun to fade into background scenery, its presence no longer charged with spectacle. Dust gathered at its base, and no one paused before it. Inside the infirmary, Lisa Lott instructed a small group of prisoners on recognizing early signs of heat exhaustion, demonstrating how to check pulse rate with 2 fingers against the wrist, how to measure water intake rather than guessing. Her voice carried steady authority, not raised, not urgent. Whitaker stood nearby, arms crossed, allowing her to lead. This was no longer a concession. It was practicality. As evening approached and the sky shifted from pale blue to streaks of amber, a quiet exchange took place outside the infirmary door. One of the prisoners who had once supported the accusation stepped forward, hat in hand, and spoke a brief apology in German. Lisa Lott listened without interruption. When he finished, she inclined her head once and replied that care does not keep score. The man stepped back, shoulders less rigid. From the porch of the administration building, Callahan witnessed the exchange without intruding. He felt no need to formalize it. The compound was adjusting on its own. Lanterns flickered on as darkness settled, casting long shadows across the yard. The air cooled to 79 degrees, carrying the distant lowing of cattle beyond the wire. Inside her small quarters, Lisa Lott reviewed her notes by lamplight, recording temperatures and supply counts with the same precision she had shown under scrutiny. She did not reflect on vindication. She reflected on dosage. Across the compound, Callahan removed his cap and set it on his desk. Aware that leadership rarely announces its results, it reveals them in atmosphere. And as the camp drifted into another Texas night, steady and unremarkable. The quiet precedent set days earlier had begun to root itself deeper than any rope ever could. By the second week after the review, the rhythm of the camp had settled into something steadier, almost disciplined by its own example. Dawn broke at 6:15 with a pale wash of light over the Texas plains, the air already warm at 78 degrees, promising another day near 100. Captain Edward Callahan stood outside his quarters with a tin cup of black coffee, watching work details assemble in quiet lines. Boots aligned, voices low, he noticed something subtle that had not been there before. Fewer rigid shoulders, fewer defiant stares, structure remained, but the edge had softened. Inside the infirmary, Liselott Hartmann prepared for the morning round, sleeves folded with exact symmetry, notebook open to a fresh page. She had begun implementing a simple chart system on the wall, marking hydration levels with small penciled lines that could be erased and corrected. Sergeant Thomas Whitaker observed that the ward felt less reactive now, more preventative. Fewer emergencies, more instruction. Liselott spent part of the morning teaching 2 prisoners assigned to cleaning detail how to recognize early heat stress, explaining that when the body loses water faster than it can replace it, confusion arrives before collapse. She spoke calmly, never elevating her tone. The men listened with the focus of students rather than detainees. Outside, Lieutenant Harold Bennett approached Callahan with a folded update from Regional Command. Oversight would continue, but no disciplinary action was warranted. The wording was restrained, almost reluctant. Callahan read it once, then handed it back without comment. The matter, it seemed, had moved from controversy to record. By midday, the temperature reached 99 degrees, the sun flattening shadows across the yard. A water break was called earlier than usual, and Callahan made no objection. Adaptation was not weakness. It was awareness. From the infirmary doorway, Liselott watched as prisoners moved toward the pump in orderly lines, measuring water in tin cups rather than gulping. She recognized the shift not as gratitude, but as habit-forming. Later in the afternoon, the wooden post was finally removed from the center of the yard, carried away by 2 guards without announcement. It left behind only a patch of lighter dust where it had stood. No ceremony marked its absence. No speech declared its meaning. Callahan noticed the empty space during his evening walk and paused briefly. The yard felt larger without it, less theatrical. Inside her small quarters that night, Liselott wrote a single line in her notebook beneath the day's medical entries. Stability improves outcomes. She closed the cover gently and set it beside her cot. Across the compound, Callahan reviewed inspection logs under lamplight, aware that leadership is rarely remembered for what it enforces, but for what it refuses to allow. Outside, the temperature eased to 82 degrees as stars emerged over the open Texas sky. The camp did not transform into something sentimental or soft. It remained a place of fences and regulations. Yet within those boundaries, a different expectation had taken root. Dignity had not disrupted order. It had clarified it. And as the wind moved quietly through the wire and across the packed earth where the post once stood, the standard held. By the end of the 3rd week, the change was no longer subtle. It had settled into the daily mechanics of the camp like dust into floorboards. Mornings began at 6 with a whistle and the scrape of boots, the air already hovering near 80 degrees, but the infirmary lights were often on before the call to line up. Liselott Hartmann had started arriving 15 minutes early, reviewing the previous day's notes, adjusting water allocations based on forecasted heat index. She had convinced Sergeant Thomas Whitaker to reposition 2 cots closer to the cross breeze near the eastern windows, reducing afternoon temperatures inside by nearly 3 degrees. Small adjustments, measurable results. Captain Edward Callahan received the weekly efficiency report on a Wednesday afternoon when the thermometer outside his office read 98 degrees. He scanned the columns. Fewer medical incidents, reduced disciplinary write-ups, improved work output stability. Numbers rarely told the full story, but they confirmed a pattern. Lieutenant Harold Bennett remarked that morale appeared steadier. Callahan responded that morale was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. Later that day, a minor dispute arose between 2 prisoners over work rotation. Voices rose briefly, tension tightening the air. Instead of escalating, One of the men paused and suggested taking the matter to the shift supervisor. Procedure over spectacle, Callahan observed from a distance, noting the instinct to redirect, rather than inflame. Inside the infirmary, Lieselot treated a strained shoulder with careful compression wrapping, explaining the importance of rest intervals measured in minutes rather than guesswork. Her tone remained composed, instructional. Whitaker had begun deferring to her judgment openly, consulting her before adjusting supply requests. The partnership no longer felt provisional. It felt practical. As evening approached and the temperature finally eased to 85 degrees, a faint breeze moved through the compound, lifting the edge of canvas tarps and cooling sunburned skin. Callahan walked the yard and measured steps, pausing where the wooden post once stood. The space remained empty, unremarkable now, as if it had always been so. He considered how quickly a symbol can lose its power when no one chooses to revive it. In her quarters, Lieselot wrote another line beneath her medical entries. Prevention requires patience. She closed the notebook and listened to the distant murmur of voices settling into night. There had been no ceremony marking the shift in atmosphere, no declaration pinned to a bulletin board. It had happened through repetition, through consistency, through refusal to let humiliation define order. As stars emerged above the wide Texas sky and lanterns flickered along the walkways, Captain Edward Callahan understood that leadership is rarely remembered for dramatic gestures. It is remembered for the quiet standards it refuses to lower. And inside the infirmary, beneath the steady turning of ceiling fans, Lieselot Hartmann prepared for another day, aware that dignity, once established, must be practiced daily to remain intact. By early September, the heat began to shift in character, still heavy but edged with the faintest hint of change. Mornings starting at 74 degrees instead of 80, the sky carrying a softer light across the wide Texas plain. The camp moved with its established rhythm, boots on gravel at 6, work details assigned by 6:30, water breaks scheduled with near-mechanical precision. Inside the infirmary, Lieselot Hartmann had introduced a rotating duty chart so that 2 prisoners each day assisted with sanitation and supply checks, transforming observation into participation. She explained each task without authority in her tone, only clarity, and the men followed instructions not because they were compelled, but because the system functioned. Sergeant Thomas Whitaker now kept the supply ledger open on the main table, trusting her to note shortages before they became problems. Outside, Captain Edward Callahan reviewed the monthly summary beneath the shade of the administration porch, the air hovering at 88 degrees by mid-morning. The numbers confirmed what he already sensed. Medical incidents down by nearly 30%, disciplinary reports reduced by half. Lieutenant Harold Bennett remarked that Regional Command had taken interest in the improved efficiency. Callahan responded that efficiency was a byproduct, not the objective. The objective was steadiness. Later that afternoon, a brief thunderhead gathered on the horizon, dark clouds rolling in from the west and dropping a short, sharp rain that cooled the yard to 79 degrees. Prisoners stood beneath the eaves of barracks watching water strike the dust, the scent of wet earth rising in clean waves. Lieselot stepped to the infirmary doorway and let a few drops touch her sleeve before returning inside to adjust ventilation as humidity climbed. The moment passed quickly, leaving the compound washed and quieter. In the early evening, a young guard approached Callahan and mentioned that he had reconsidered how he handled minor infractions, choosing conversation before reprimand. Callahan listened without overt approval, only nodding once. Standards ripple outward. That night, under a sky cleared of clouds and scattered with stars, Lieselot sat at her small desk and wrote another line beneath her medical notes. Calm is contagious. She closed the notebook and set it carefully beside her cot. Across the compound, Callahan stood near the perimeter fence, hands resting lightly behind his back, listening to the steady hum of insects and distant cattle beyond the wire. The camp remained what it was, a place defined by boundaries and oversight. But within those boundaries something durable had taken root. It was not sentiment. It was not leniency. It was expectation, the expectation that decisions would be measured, that correction would not require spectacle, that dignity would not be suspended for convenience. As the temperature dipped to 76 degrees and lanterns dimmed one by one, the compound settled into sleep with a steadiness that felt earned, and in the quiet between one day and the next, both Captain Edward Callahan and Liselott Hartmann understood the same unspoken truth. Leadership is not proven in the moment of command alone, but in the consistency that follows it. By mid-September, the air over Camp Hearn carried a different texture, mornings beginning at 72 degrees and warming slowly rather than all at once, the sky stretching wide and pale above the flat Texas horizon. The camp had entered a season of quiet repetition, routines settling so deeply they no longer required explanation. Inside the infirmary, Liselott Hartmann reviewed the monthly supply inventory with Sergeant Thomas Whitaker, calculating gauze usage against recorded cases, adjusting orders in precise quantities rather than estimates. The numbers told a steady story. Fewer emergency interventions, fewer heat-related incidents, shorter recovery times. Whitaker remarked that the ward felt less like a place of reaction and more like a place of preparation. Liselott answered that prevention is quieter than rescue, but often stronger. Outside, Captain Edward Callahan met with Lieutenant Harold Bennett beneath the administration porch as a mild breeze moved across the yard at 81 degrees. Bennett informed him that Regional Command had circulated a brief note referencing improved operational stability at the camp. No fanfare, no commendation, only acknowledgement. Callahan read the summary once and folded it carefully. He understood that recognition was not the point. Endurance was, later. That afternoon, a group of prisoners requested permission to organize a brief educational session on heat awareness before the next work cycle. The suggestion traveled through proper channels and reached Callahan's desk. He approved it without hesitation. The session took place in the shadow of the barracks, Liselott demonstrating pulse checks and hydration measurements, while Whitaker translated technical terms where needed. There was no tension in the crowd, only attention, as the sun lowered and the temperature eased to 78 degrees. Callahan walked the perimeter fence in measured steps, noting how conversation drifted more easily across the yard. The absence of spectacle had created space for routine. In her quarters that evening, Liselott wrote beneath her daily notes, "Systems strengthen people." She paused for a moment, then closed the notebook with deliberate care. She did not dwell on the day she had stood beneath open sky with a word hanging at her neck. She dwelled on dosage, on pulse, on steady breath. Across the compound, Callahan stood near the open gate watching the horizon fade from gold to deep blue. He considered how easily authority can mistake control for order. True order, he had learned, required restraint. Lanterns flickered on along the walkways, casting long lines of light across the dust where the wooden post had once stood. Nothing marked the spot now. No sign, no shadow. Yet the space held memory in a quieter form. The camp remained fenced and regulated, defined by schedules and oversight, but it had also become defined by expectation. Expectation that discipline would not humiliate, that competence would not be silenced, that dignity would not depend on convenience. As the temperature dropped to 75 degrees and the compound settled into night, both Captain Edward Callahan and Liselott Hartmann understood that what had changed was not the structure of the camp, but the standard within it. And standards, once raised, rarely returned to their former height. Autumn settled slowly over the Texas plain, mornings beginning at 68 degrees and carrying a crispness that hinted at change beyond the fences. The compound at Camp Hearn moved with the quiet efficiency of a system that no longer strained against itself. Boots still struck gravel at 6 o'clock, lanterns still dimmed at night. Reports still passed across Captain Edward Callahan's desk in neat columns of ink. Yet something deeper had shifted, not in the rules, but in the tone that carried them. Inside the infirmary, Liselott Hartmann closed her notebook on the final day of September and ran her hand once across the wooden table where charts and thermometers had rested for weeks. The ward was calm, cots aligned, windows cracked just enough to let in the cooler breeze. Sergeant Thomas Whitaker remarked that the camp had not recorded a single severe heat case in 10 consecutive days. Numbers, again, steady. Outside, Lieutenant Harold Bennett mentioned that other facilities had begun requesting guidance on preventive medical routines. Callahan listened, eyes tracing the open yard where men moved in measured lines beneath a sky no longer harsh but wide and clear. The absence of spectacle had become ordinary. The wooden post was gone, replaced by open space where dust lay undisturbed. No one spoke of what had once stood there. It did not need to be named. That afternoon, Lieselot conducted one final instructional session before winter rotation adjustments, demonstrating pulse measurement and hydration tracking to a new group assigned to sanitation detail. Her voice carried the same even cadence it had from the beginning. No edge, no excess. When the session ended, one prisoner paused and said quietly that the camp felt different than it had at the start of summer. She answered that systems change when people choose them. As evening approached and the temperature settled at 74 degrees, Callahan walked the perimeter fence in slow, deliberate steps. He paused near the open stretch where the yard felt widest and looked across the compound that remained fenced, regulated, and bound by war. Yet within those boundaries, something unbound had taken root. Authority had not weakened. It had clarified. Discipline had not softened. It had steadied. Later, in her small quarters, Lieselot packed away her notebook into a simple canvas bag, unsure how long her assignment would last or where she might be transferred next. She did not reflect on accusation or scrutiny. She reflected on pulse rates lowered, fevers prevented, tension eased. Across the compound, Callahan removed his cap and placed it carefully on his desk, aware that leadership is not measured by how loudly it commands, but by what it refuses to permit. Outside, under a sky brushed with early autumn stars, the camp settled into quiet. Fences still stood. Schedules still held, but the standard within them had risen. And in that rise, without speeches or applause, both a British officer and a German nurse had proven the same truth. Dignity does not require permission. It requires someone willing to stand still long enough to defend it.